In April 1967, 4 MiG-17 fighters climbed into the sky over North Vietnam to intercept 24 American F-4 Phantoms. The MiGs belonged to the Vietnamese Air Force. The men inside them did not. They were North Korean pilots flying under Vietnamese command in a unit that official histories would hide behind a single letter, Group Z. Before the engagement ended, 2 of their aircraft would be destroyed. Both pilots would escape their MiGs, but neither would survive. And the greatest problem was not simply that they had been outnumbered. According to one detailed account of the engagement, the Korean pilots could not communicate with the Vietnamese controllers directing them into battle. So, how did North Korea place its own fighter pilots inside Vietnamese aircraft and send them to fight Americans in a war where their presence was not supposed to be acknowledged? For decades, the public evidence was little more than rumor. Vietnamese histories mentioned a mysterious flying organization called Doan Z, or Group Z, but offered almost nothing about who served in it. North Korea said even less. The secrecy was real, but it was not perfect. A now declassified American intelligence report recorded that by December 2, 1966, at least 17 North Korean pilots had already been observed conducting familiarization flights near Hanoi. It was the 4th time their presence had been noted. That meant American intelligence had detected part of the deployment before Group Z entered regular combat. But the pilots meeting MiGs at hundreds of miles per hour had no practical way to know the nationality of the man in the other cockpit. The aircraft carried Vietnamese markings. The Koreans were expected to wear Vietnamese uniforms. And on paper, they were not even supposed to be called combat volunteers. They were specialists. That carefully chosen word began with a decision made months earlier by one of the most famous commanders of the Vietnam War. North Korea had been offering direct military support since 1965. Kim Il-sung publicly called for volunteers and presented Vietnam as another front in the struggle against the United States, but his motives were not purely symbolic. The war offered North Korea something it could not obtain in training, a chance to study American tactics in actual combat. South Korean forces were already fighting in Vietnam, and Pyongyang viewed the conflict as a laboratory for a future confrontation on the Korean peninsula. North Korea eventually asked Hanoi for permission to send an entire Air Force regiment. That created a political problem. North Vietnam accepted weapons, advisors, and material from other communist countries, but its leaders wanted the war to be understood as a Vietnamese struggle. A visible foreign combat unit could weaken that claim. On September 21, 1966, General Voy Win Giap chaired the meeting that decided the issue. He approved the North Korean request, but only within strict limits. The Koreans would command their own personnel internally. Vietnam would define their area of operations, select their missions, and retain overall authority. Giap ordered the two sides to make the command relationship precise enough to prevent what the translated Vietnamese record called unfortunate complications, and the North Koreans would officially be described as specialists, even though Giap's own decision acknowledged what they really were: volunteer soldiers. The mission was secret by design before the first pilot ever arrived. If you enjoy discovering the hidden history behind America's wars, subscribe to Forgotten War Stories, because the agreement Giap approved was only the beginning of the problem. 9 days later, Vietnamese and North Korean military delegations signed a detailed protocol. The original plan called for North Korea to provide enough personnel for 2 10 aircraft companies of MiG-17s, followed by a MiG-21 company when more aircraft became available. Vietnam would provide the airplanes. It would also provide communications, maintenance, technical support, fuel, housing, medical care, and nearly everything required to keep those airplanes in the sky. North Korea would train the pilots before departure. Once in Vietnam, they would receive only the additional instruction needed to adapt to local weather, battlefield conditions, and the American aircraft they would face. On paper, it was an elegant division of labor. North Korea supplied men who wanted combat experience. Vietnam supplied the war in which they could obtain it. But the arrangement divided responsibility at the point where a fighter unit most needs unity. The Koreans led their own men. Vietnamese headquarters assigned their missions. Vietnamese controllers guided them toward American formations. Vietnamese crews maintained the aircraft. And every urgent instruction had to cross not just a radio channel, but a language barrier. The protocol had created a fighting unit. It had also built its central weakness into the command structure. The first contingent arrived during the winter of 1966 into 1967 under Colonel Kim Chang-yun. One academic reconstruction identifies 24 pilots and 113 mechanics, ground crewmen, political officers, and other support personnel in that initial group. 10 of the pilots were qualified on one version of the MiG-17 and 14 on another. They were assigned to North Vietnam's 923rd Fighter Regiment at Kep Air Base, northeast of Hanoi. The Vietnamese designation was Group Z. Kep placed them close to the most heavily contested airspace in North Vietnam. By early 1967, American missions were pushing toward targets that had once been restricted, while Vietnamese MiGs used ground radar controllers to choose when and where to attack. The MiG-77 looked outdated beside the F-4 Phantom. It was subsonic, smaller, and based on a design descended from the Korean War, but it could turn tightly, carried cannon, and remained dangerous when controllers placed it in the right position. The American Phantom was much faster and carried radar-guided and heat-seeking missiles. Yet early versions had no internal gun, and American crews were often protecting strike aircraft burdened with bombs, fuel concerns, and a mission over hostile territory. Group Z did not need to defeat the entire American formation. Like the Vietnamese pilots beside them, the Koreans could disrupt a raid by forcing bomb-laden aircraft to turn, jettison their weapons, or defend themselves. But first, they had to reach the Americans as a coordinated force. The North Koreans began flying sorties in February 1967. Vietnamese instructors had taught them about the tactics American pilots were using. Korean-speaking Vietnamese interpreters assisted during ground instruction and training flights. The pilots were expected to arrive technically proficient. Then training became combat. In the first reported engagement that April, 4 Korean-flown MiG-17s joined 2 Vietnamese MiG-21s against a formation of 24 American F-4s. The numbers were already severe. The communications failure made them worse. The Korean pilots reportedly lacked interpreters and could not coordinate effectively with either the Vietnamese ground controllers or the MiG-21 pilots fighting beside them. The Americans overwhelmed the formation and destroyed 2 MiG-17s. Both North Korean pilots ejected, but both later died from the consequences of leaving their aircraft. The problem did not end with that battle. A Vietnamese MiG-17 pilot later recalled that multiple Group Z pilots suffered devastating injuries during ejection because of difficulty using the system correctly. This is where the original plan collided with the reality of air combat. A pilot might master the airplane. He might understand the enemy's basic tactics. He might be willing to fight without hesitation. But willingness could not replace a clear command structure, familiar emergency procedures, or a voice on the radio he could immediately understand. North Vietnamese Lieutenant General Tran Han later described the Koreans as extraordinarily brave and intensely proud. Their courage is not the disputed part of the story. Their results are. Vietnamese and North Korean accounts later credited Group Z with shooting down 26 American aircraft. It is a powerful number. It has been repeated in state histories, newspaper reports, and modern summaries of the unit. But American combat records do not support it. That does not prove North Korean pilots never shot down an American aircraft. Air combat claims from Vietnam are notoriously difficult to reconcile. Several pilots could claim the same target. An aircraft damaged by a MiG might be recorded as lost to another cause, and American records normally identify the opposing airplane and location, not the nationality of a pilot hidden inside a Vietnamese marked MiG. What it does mean is that 26 cannot responsibly be presented as a confirmed score. Even the size of Group Z changes dramatically between sources. A retired Vietnamese major general who worked with the Koreans stated that 87 North Korean Air Force personnel served in Vietnam between 1967 and early 1969. A later academic study estimated 384 total personnel, including 96 pilots, with 87 believed to have flown in combat. Those figures describe very different organizations. The surviving record is not complete enough to make either one a final answer. But there is one number supported by the cemetery, official acknowledgments, and multiple independent accounts. 14 North Korean Air Force personnel died in Vietnam. 12 are generally described as combat deaths and 2 as non-combat deaths, although some North Korean officials and defectors later suggested the true toll may have been higher. The propaganda claimed 26 victories. The graves recorded 14 lives that did not return home. And as losses accumulated, Hanoi began to reconsider the experiment. By early 1969, the aviation deployment was curtailed. One scholarly account concludes that the poor combat performance and mounting aircraft losses contributed to the decision, but Group Z was also being overtaken by a larger political change. North Vietnam was moving toward negotiations with the United States. North Korea preferred a more uncompromising strategy that would keep American forces tied down in Asia. At the same time, Kim Il-sung's government had opened a dangerous new confrontation of its own by attacking the South Korean presidential residence and seizing the USS Pueblo in January 1968. The relationship between Pyongyang and Hanoi cooled. The North Korean generals most closely associated with the aggressive policy lost influence at home. Choi Kwang, who had negotiated the pilot agreement, was removed as chief of the North Korean General Staff in 1969. Group Z had entered Vietnam as proof of communist solidarity. It ended as the interests of the two governments moved apart. The unit had gained the experience Pyongyang wanted, but at a price. Hanoi no longer appeared willing to pay in aircraft, coordination, and political risk. Then, the pilots disappeared from the public history of the war. North Korea and Vietnam did not publicly acknowledge the combat deployment until 2,025 years after the war ended. By then, the most concrete evidence was already standing on a wooded hill northeast of Hanoi. 14 headstones marked the North Korean Air Force personnel who had died in Vietnam. The graves faced toward their homeland. A local Vietnamese veteran, Tuong Van Dal, cared for the site and placed flowers there in memory of men he regarded as fellow soldiers. In 2002, North Korea exhumed the remains and flew them home. The headstones stayed behind, turning the cemetery into a memorial to bodies that were no longer there and to a military operation neither government had wanted to explain in full. The acknowledgement did not solve the mystery. It confirmed that North Korean pilots had fought Americans. It did not produce a complete roster, an uncontested mission log, or a reliable victory total. The name Group Z continued to conceal almost as much as it revealed. That is why the newest development matters. In August 2026, Vietnam announced that it would build a memorial and restore the North Korean cemetery site. Nearly 60 years after the pilots arrived, the project has returned attention to one of the strangest hidden chapters of the Vietnam War. The North Korean MiGs were not invisible to American intelligence. Their courage was remembered by the Vietnamese airmen who worked beside them. Their dead were buried beneath named stones. Yet the mission remained caught between secrecy and propaganda, hidden when silence was useful, then enlarged by a victory claim the surviving American record cannot confirm. The most important truth does not require that claim. North Korea sent pilots to learn how Americans fought. Vietnam gave them aircraft, uniforms, airfields, and missions, and American aviators met them in combat without being able to see the one fact that made Group Z extraordinary. The MiGs were Vietnamese, the pilots were not. For decades, 14 graves said more about that secret war than either government was willing to admit. If you want more forgotten war stories that sound impossible but really happened, subscribe and follow us.